A homeless veteran slept in an old van beside a frozen harbor in Maine. The town had heard his name before, but never the truth behind it. All he had left was a German shepherd named Mara, and a silence only she seemed to understand. Then a lawyer brought him a strange inheritance, a stone house beneath a dead lighthouse. A company offered him $2 million to walk away before he even knew what he owned. But on the first night, Mara heard something beneath the cellar that no human wanted to remember. Stay with this story and tell me where you're watching from. If it touches your heart, please like and subscribe to help this channel reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories alive. Winter Harbor did not wake like other towns. It opened its eyes slowly under a white quilt of snow, while the Atlantic breathed against the black rocks below. The roofs along Main Street wore soft caps of powder. Yellow strings of dock lights trembled in the wind. The fishing boats rested in the harbor with their hulls locked in thin ice, looking less like machines than sleeping beasts from some old northern legend, waiting for spring to call their names. Beside the harbor, near a weather-bent bait shed and a row of lobster traps stacked like wooden ribs, an old Ford Econoline sat under a shawl of frost. Inside the van, Caleb Whitaker opened his eyes before sunrise. He always did. At 57, his body still kept the habits of a younger man in harder places. He woke without an alarm. He listened before he moved. He knew the weight of silence, the angle of light, the difference between wind against metal and a footstep outside. Those instincts had once been praised as discipline. Later, they had become one more reason people said he looked like a man waiting for trouble. Mara lifted her head from the blanket near his boots. She was a 6-year-old German shepherd, black and gold, built with the clean strength of a working dog. Her dark saddle spread across her back like a winter cloak, while the fur along her chest and legs held the deep honey color of pine wood warmed by fire. One ear stood tall, the other bent slightly at the tip, a small old injury that gave her solemn face a strangely human touch. A thin, pale streak ran down the bridge of her nose, as if some careful hand had brushed moonlight there and forgotten to finish. "You heard it too?" Caleb murmured. Mara blinked once. "There it is," he said. "Your official report." She gave a quiet huff and set her chin back down, but her amber eyes stayed open. Caleb sat up slowly. The van complained under him with a small metallic groan. His shoulders brushed the hanging wool blanket he used to keep the cold from swallowing the whole place. The Econoline smelled faintly of old canvas, coffee, dog fur, and the sea. Not pleasant, perhaps, but honest. A man could live with honest. He pulled on his faded army green t-shirt, then the red and black flannel jacket that had become as much a part of him as his own tired hands. The collar was frayed. One cuff had been repaired with dark thread that did not match. Over the years, the flannel had lost any right to be called warm, but Caleb wore it anyway. Some clothes became a kind of testimony. They said, "I have been through weather. I have not yet come apart." His old military pants were folded beside the driver's seat. His boots sat underneath, brown leather, scarred and carefully oiled. He dressed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once packed his life into smaller spaces than a van. Mara rose when he did. Around her neck was a dark brown leather collar, softened by years of use, with a round brass tag that clicked gently whenever she moved. Caleb had scratched a newer phone number beneath an older one on the back. It was not beautiful work, but it was his. Outside, the snow was still falling, bright and dry. It made even the bait shed look almost holy, which Caleb considered a suspicious achievement. He opened the side door. Cold entered like a priest with bad manners. Mara stepped down first, landing lightly on the packed snow. She turned and waited. She always waited. Even now, even after years of having no real home, she still believed there was a proper way for Caleb to come into the morning. He followed, breath fogging silver. "Don't look at me like that," he told her. "I'm not the one who ordered winter." Mara looked at the harbor. Fine. I may have signed for it. The town was beginning to stir. A plow growled somewhere beyond the post office. Smoke lifted from chimneys in soft gray ropes. In the diner windows, yellow light bloomed against the blue dawn. Winter Harbor was beautiful enough to break a heart and small enough to remember who had broken what. Caleb walked toward the public restroom by the marina to wash up. Mara padded beside him without pulling the leash. The leash was paracord, olive green, braided by Caleb's own hands during a week when sleep had refused him. Mara did not need much restraint. She stayed with him because she chose to. That mattered more than any knot. A pickup passed slowly. The driver, a man Caleb recognized from the docks, lifted 2 fingers from the wheel. Not a wave, not nothing. In Winter Harbor, there were many kinds of almost. Caleb returned the gesture. That was how most people treated him now, not cruelly. Cruelty would have been easier in a way. A man could answer cruelty. He could stand against it, name it, file it away. But what Caleb lived with was softer and more patient. Voices lowered when he stepped into a room. Laughter paused, then resumed in a different shape. Folks looked at his old military jacket the way they might look at a torn flag found in a ditch, with pity, discomfort, and a private wish that someone else would pick it up. Years ago, Caleb Whitaker had worn the uniform with the clean pride of a man who believed service was a language everyone understood. Army Ranger, team leader. The sort of man commanders trusted with difficult maps and difficult nights. Then came the leak. That was what the papers called it. A leak? Such a small word for something that could drown a life. It involved a defense contractor, mishandled transport records, dangerous materials moved under prettier names, and a report Caleb had made because regulations existed for reasons beyond paperwork. He had believed the truth would climb upward if he pushed hard enough from below. Instead, the truth had been given boots, a name, and a face. His. No public trial, no clean clearing of the air, just closed doors, careful statements, and the slow ruin of a reputation. His discharge had not used the ugliest words, but shame did not need ugly words. It knew how to read between the lines. After that, people who had once clapped his shoulder began sending shorter messages. His marriage thinned into silence, then paperwork. Doors did not slam, they simply stopped opening. Mara had come to him in that season. She had belonged to a man named Aaron Pike, though Caleb almost never spoke that name aloud before breakfast. Aaron had been a friend, a handler, and the kind of soldier who could make a joke in a downpour without making the rain feel mocked. Mara had worked beside him with the grave intelligence of a creature who understood duty without needing medals. The training accident that ended Aaron's career did not leave the sort of images people whispered about. It was quieter than that. A bad day, a wrong angle, a life divided into before and after. Aaron went home to a world that no longer fit him, and Mara, retired from service, came to Caleb with her brass tag, her bent ear, and a grief so disciplined it looked like patience. From then on, they guarded each other. Not dramatically, not like in movies. Mara woke him when his breathing changed in sleep. Caleb warmed her food when the cold made her joints stiff. She leaned against his leg when he stood too long staring at the ocean. He checked her paws for ice after every walk. They were 2 damaged veterans of different wars, keeping a watch no one had assigned them. That morning, Caleb took his usual route past the diner. He did not intend to go in. He had $3, a half tank of gas, and enough pride to make both problems worse. But Mara stopped outside the window. Inside, a few fishermen sat at the counter, shoulders hunched over coffee. Someone laughed. Then one of them glanced out and saw Caleb. The laughter softened, like a radio turned down in another room. Mara looked from the window to Caleb. "No," he said. "We're not doing the sad breakfast inspection." She sat. Caleb sighed. That is emotional blackmail. Mara's tail swept once across the snow. He almost smiled. The feeling surprised him, a small warm fish moving under ice. Before he could decide whether to surrender to the diner or continue pretending dignity was nutritious, a woman's voice spoke behind him. "Mr. Whitaker?" Caleb turned. The woman standing near the curb was in her late 60s, maybe older, wrapped in a dark wool coat dusted with snow. Her hair was silver, pinned neatly beneath a navy hat. She held a leather satchel in one hand and a folded envelope in the other. She did not look like a tourist. Tourists stared at the harbor first. This woman stared at Caleb as if she had crossed 3 counties to find a particular sentence and meant to deliver it correctly. Mara stood, not aggressively, but completely. The woman noticed. To her credit, she did not step back. She lowered her gaze to Mara and gave the smallest nod. "That must be Mara," she said. "I was told she would decide whether I was worth your time." Caleb studied her. "Depends who told you." "Evelyn March," she said. "Attorney at law, Ellsworth office, though I make house calls when the house is a van." "Not a house," Caleb said. Evelyn looked at the Econoline, its frosted windows, its dented side panel, the blanket curtain visible through the windshield. "No," she said gently. "I suppose not." He expected pity then. People often put it on like a scarf, thinking it made them kinder. Evelyn did not. Her face remained composed, lined by age and weather, but not soft in the wrong way. "I represent the estate of Silas Whitaker," she said. The name struck no great bell in Caleb. It was more like finding an old coin in a coat pocket and realizing it came from a country that no longer existed. "My grandfather," he said. "Your maternal grandfather." "I never knew him." "I gathered that." Caleb glanced toward the diner window. The men inside were pretending not to watch, which meant they were watching with great effort. Evelyn followed his glance. "Would you prefer somewhere private?" Caleb looked at the van, then at the harbor, then at Mara, who had not taken her eyes off the lawyer's satchel. "No place around here is private," he said. "Some just have walls." Evelyn accepted that. She unfolded the envelope, removed a few papers, and held them with gloved precision. "Silas Whitaker passed away 3 months ago. His estate has been in review due to several unusual instructions in the will. You are named as the sole living heir to his property on North Lantern Road." Caleb waited. Evelyn looked up. The stone house beneath Whitaker Light. For the first time that morning, Mara moved before Caleb did. Her head lifted, her ears angled toward the far cliffs beyond the harbor, one straight, one bent at the tip, both suddenly alive with attention. She stared through the falling snow toward a distant ridge where the old lighthouse stood, pale and narrow against the winter sky. Caleb felt the leash tighten. Not much, just enough. He frowned. "Mara." She did not look back. Evelyn noticed. "That is interesting," she said. "She likes birds," Caleb muttered. "There are no birds in that direction." "She's optimistic." A faint smile touched Evelyn's mouth, then disappeared. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck. "What house?" "The Whitaker property. Stone construction, late 19th century. Attached cellar, private access road, and a decommissioned lighthouse above the cliff. It has been vacant for some time." "Then sell it." "I cannot." "Why not?" "Because the will requires that you take possession before any sale can be considered. And because there is a condition." "Of course there is." Evelyn read from the paper. "The wine cellar is not to be demolished, opened by force, or structurally altered before the 3rd full moon of winter stands upon the water." Caleb stared at her. Snow ticked softly against the shoulders of his flannel. "Say that again," he said. Evelyn did. Caleb looked toward the harbor, then back at her. Was my grandfather fond of salted tea and dramatic weather? I never had tea with him. That doesn't answer the question. No, Evelyn said, but from what little I know, Silas Whitaker had a habit of making practical matters sound like scripture. Caleb gave a dry breath that was not quite a laugh. A cursed cellar. That's new. I did not say cursed. You didn't have to. This town probably did it for you. At that, Evelyn's expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. You've heard the stories? I've heard stories are cheaper than heating oil. Mara pulled again. This time Caleb felt it in his shoulder. The dog was no longer merely alert. Her whole body had shifted toward the cliffs, muscles gathered beneath her winter coat. She was not frightened. Caleb knew frightened. He knew the little signs, the lowered tail, the white at the edge of the eyes, the breath catching behind the teeth. This was different. This was recognition. As if somewhere beyond the harbor, beyond the roofs and the thin church steeple and the road climbing toward the old lighthouse, something had called her by a name she had not been taught. Caleb's hand closed around the leash. For a moment, the town grew very quiet around him. The diner, the boats, the plow in the distance, all of it seemed to step back. He had spent years moving away from things, away from uniforms hanging in closets, away from photographs, away from dinner tables where people measured their words before passing the salt, away from the version of himself that had believed a man's good name was stronger than paper. And now Mara, who had followed him through every retreat without complaint, was pulling him toward something. Not away. Toward. It unsettled him more than any threat could have. Evelyn slid the papers back into the envelope. I can drive you there this afternoon if you wish, or tomorrow, if the road crews clear North Lantern. Caleb looked down at Mara. Snow had settled along the black ridge of her back. The pale streak on her nose caught the morning light. She did not whine. She did not beg. She simply stood facing the cliffs with a patience older than commands. "What's wrong with the place?" Caleb asked. Evelyn tilted her head. "Wrong? People don't leave stone houses under lighthouses to men living in vans unless something is wrong. Silas left it to his blood? He didn't know me." "Perhaps," Evelyn said, "he knew enough of being misunderstood to think blood might not be the most important part." That landed closer than Caleb wanted. He looked away. Across the harbor, the old lighthouse was barely visible through the snowfall, a pale finger raised against the sky. Caleb had seen it before, of course. Everyone in town had. He had simply trained himself not to look at beautiful things too long. Beauty had a way of suggesting a man deserved more than survival, and survival was already expensive. Mara stepped forward. Caleb let the leash slide an inch through his glove. "Fine," he said quietly. Evelyn waited. He cleared his throat. "I'll look at it, that's all." The lawyer nodded once, as though this was both answer and beginning. Mara finally turned back to him. Her amber eyes softened. Then, with the solemn timing of a creature who had just altered a man's fate and found the whole matter slightly obvious, she sneezed into the snow. Caleb stared at her. "Very dignified," he said. Her tail moved once. Behind them, someone in the diner laughed for real this time. Not cruelly, not nervously, just laughed. Caleb felt the sound touch him and not wound him. That, too, was strange. He took the envelope from Evelyn March. The paper was heavier than he expected. Or maybe it was only that he had grown unused to holding anything that pointed toward a future. The snow kept falling over Winter Harbor, over the red roofs and yellow lights, over the resting boats and the old van beside the bait shed. Far beyond the town, the lighthouse waited on its cliff, white as a bone, patient as a promise. Caleb Whitaker had no faith in inheritances, curses, or grandfathers who wrote like prophets with water damage. But Mara was already facing the road, and for the first time in years she was not following him out of a place. She was leading him toward one. By noon, the road to North Lantern had been cleared just enough for Evelyn March's sedan to complain its way up the hill. Caleb followed behind in the Econoline, with Mara sitting upright in the passenger seat, like a judge who had seen worse roads and found this one poorly argued. The van climbed past spruce trees burdened with snow, past low stone walls half swallowed by drifts, past mailboxes tilted like old sailors after a long night. Every few minutes the sea flashed between the trees. Blue steel, white teeth. Endless breath. Winter Harbor fell behind them without disappearing. Caleb could still see the little town below, its red roofs and church steeple tucked against the shore, as if the whole place had curled up for warmth. He had lived beside that harbor for months, yet from this height it looked smaller, gentler, almost innocent. That was the trick of distance. It made even judgment look like weather. The road narrowed near the cliff. Then the lighthouse appeared. It stood on a rise of dark rock, white and slender, its lantern room dull beneath a cap of snow. No beam had turned there for years, but the tower still seemed to be watching the ocean with the patience of something older than disappointment. Beneath it, tucked into the slope, as if built from the cliff's own bones, stood the house. Caleb slowed the van. The stone house was not ugly. That irritated him a little. He had prepared himself for rot, broken shutters, the damp theatrical misery of a place local people called cursed. Instead, the house had dignity. Its walls were pale granite, weathered but firm, each stone catching winter light with a quiet silver glow. The front door was painted a faded sea blue, not cheerful exactly, but stubborn. Curved windows faced the Atlantic. Snow softened the roofline and gathered along the sills. A narrow path led from the drive to the porch, nearly buried except where wind had swept it clean. It looked less like a haunted house than a ship that had climbed out of the sea and decided to become a home. Mara pressed her nose to the window. "Don't start," Caleb said. She gave him a look that suggested she had started long before he had arrived. Evelyn parked near a low wall. When Caleb stepped down from the van, the wind struck him clean across the face. It smelled of salt, spruce, and cold stone. Far below, waves moved among black rocks with slow white hands. Evelyn waited beside the gate, coat buttoned high, silver hair pinned beneath her navy hat. She held a ring of keys and a folder thick with papers. "The property line runs from the old access road down to the cliff fence," she said. "The lighthouse itself is decommissioned, but the tower structure remains part of the estate. The Coast Guard transferred responsibility decades ago. There are maintenance restrictions, of course." Caleb looked at the lighthouse. "Of course." "There is also the matter of the cellar. There usually is when dead men write poems into wills." Evelyn's mouth twitched. "Silas Whitaker preferred precision. Unfortunately, his precision often wore a costume." Mara stepped ahead of them, then stopped at the gate. That alone made Caleb pause. In every strange place since he had known her, Mara had waited for him to enter first. Motels, repair shops, temporary rooms above garages. The van, on the first night, when he had opened the side door and told her it was not much but it was dry. Mara had always stood back and let him cross the threshold before her, as if deciding that wherever Caleb went, she would follow and make it safe afterward. Now she stood at the gate, facing the house, still as a carved thing. Caleb rested one gloved hand lightly on her back. Beneath the thick fur, muscle gathered and held. "You know something I don't?" he murmured. Mara's bent ear flicked toward the house. "That your legal opinion?" Evelyn asked. "She charges by the biscuit." "More reasonable than most attorneys." They walked up the path. The porch boards creaked, but not with weakness, more like an old man clearing his throat before speaking. Evelyn unlocked the blue door. It opened inward on air that had been waiting. Cold, yes. Dust, certainly, but not abandonment. The front room held a stone fireplace, empty shelves, 2 covered chairs, and a round table near a window facing the sea. White sheets draped the furniture like sleeping ghosts, though Caleb disliked the thought as soon as it came. The room did not feel haunted. It felt paused. Sunlight entered through the curved windows and spilled across the floorboards. The ocean moved beyond the glass, restless and bright. A braided rug, faded by time, lay near the hearth. On the mantel sat a small brass barometer, a chipped ceramic gull, and a photograph turned face down. Caleb noticed the photograph immediately. Old habits. A room revealed itself in what people displayed, hid, or forgot to remove. Evelyn followed his gaze. "I have not inventoried every personal item yet. Silas left instructions that you be allowed to see the house before anything was cleared." Generous of him? Perhaps careful. Caleb crossed to the mantel and turned the photograph over. It showed a younger man in a heavy coat standing beside the lighthouse, one hand raised against sun glare. His hair was dark then, wind-tossed. His face had the same long planes Caleb sometimes saw in the mirror and chose not to study. Beside him stood a woman with one hand on a little girl's shoulder. The girl looked about 8, serious, chin lifted stubbornly. Caleb knew the girl before he knew her, his mother, not as the tired woman who had packed grief into neat drawers and rarely mentioned her father, not as the voice that had once told Caleb, "Some men love mysteries more than family." Here she was, small, sharp-eyed, alive in a summer dress under a wool cardigan, squinting against the Maine light. Caleb set the photograph down, gently. For a moment, the house grew less like property and more like a sentence he had entered halfway through. Evelyn said nothing. That was to her credit. Mara moved through the front room with measured steps. She sniffed the hearth, the baseboards, the old rug. Not frantically, not like a dog chasing mice. She was reading. The kitchen lay beyond an arched doorway. Its cabinets were painted cream, worn around the handles. A blue enamel kettle sat on the stove. Someone had left a row of mugs hanging from hooks, each one different, as if Silas had not believed in sets. Caleb found that oddly reassuring. A man who disliked matching mugs could not be entirely lost to madness. The back hallway led toward a narrow door. Evelyn glanced at it. "Cellar stairs." Mara stopped. The change in her was so clean, Caleb felt it before he saw it. Her tail lowered, not tucked. Her head angled toward the door. The amber of her eyes sharpened. Caleb did not open the door. Not yet. Instead, he looked around the hallway. A framed nautical chart hung beside the cellar entrance, its paper yellowed beneath glass. Lines of depth and current curled around the coast like old handwriting. Someone, Silas presumably, had marked the area beneath the lighthouse in pencil. 3 small circles, 1 wavy line. Caleb leaned closer. Evelyn noticed. He was a naval engineer, tidal structures, coastal foundations, wartime harbor works, later, private surveys. "You said he was considered eccentric." "I said others considered him eccentric." "That lawyer answer cost extra?" "No, that one was complimentary." Caleb almost smiled. The pencil marks bothered him, though he could not have said why. They were too careful to be doodles, too plain to be decorative. He had spent years looking at maps where the smallest symbol could mean a safe road, a blocked bridge, a mistake no one could afford. Mara lifted one paw and touched the cellar door. Not scratching, not forcing, just touching. The sound was soft, a single wooden tap in the quiet hall. Caleb looked at the door, then at the strange marks on the chart, then back at Mara. The house, which had seemed merely paused, now felt as if it were holding its breath. Evelyn cleared her throat. "The local name for the property is the Bride's Lantern." Caleb kept his eyes on Mara. "That sounds expensive and unfortunate." It comes from an old story. Fishermen claim to see light from below the house on certain full moon nights, not from the lighthouse, from beneath. Some said it was a bride waiting for a ship that never came. People do love making women wait in stories. They do. And the truth? The truth is that coastal towns are full of fog, reflective water, and people with time to improve boredom. Caleb grunted. So no bride. I have found no bride in the title records. Good. One less tenant. Mara did not move from the cellar door. Caleb finally reached for the handle. Evelyn's hand lifted slightly, not stopping him, but remembering the will. I'm not demolishing it, he said, just looking. The door opened onto narrow wooden stairs, descending into dark. Cold air rose from below, colder than the house, carrying the mineral smell of stone and the faint sourness of old wood. Mara leaned forward, nostrils working. Then she stepped back. That made Caleb pay attention. Mara did not step back from shadows. He closed the door. Later, he said quietly. Mara looked up at him, not pleased, but accepting. That was the thing about trained courage. It knew waiting was sometimes part of survival. They continued through the house. Evelyn explained the paperwork as they walked. Taxes paid through the year, structural inspection incomplete, restrictions around cliff access, utilities functional but unreliable, generator in a shed behind the kitchen. Caleb listened with half an ear. The other half remained in the hallway with the chart and the cellar door. Upstairs, the bedroom windows faced the sea. Snow light filled the rooms. There was a narrow bed with a brass frame, a writing desk, a shelf of engineering manuals, and a cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Everything was plain, almost severe, but not uncared for. On the desk sat an old compass. Caleb picked it up. The brass casing was worn where fingers had held it often. The needle trembled, found north, trembled again. Silas's? He asked. Yes, Evelyn said. He carried it even after he stopped working. According to one neighbor, he said modern instruments were useful, but a compass had better manners. Caleb turned the compass in his palm. It was heavier than expected. There had been a time when he trusted direction. North was north. Orders were orders. Wrong was wrong. Then men in clean offices had taught him that directions could be rewritten after the fact, that maps could be edited, that blame could be assigned like cargo. He set the compass down. From outside came the crunch of tires on snow. Evelyn frowned. I was not expecting anyone. Caleb looked through the window. A black SUV had stopped near the gate. The vehicle was clean in a way that offended the road. A man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, leather gloves, and shoes too polished for cliffside slush. He was about Caleb's age, perhaps a little younger, with silver hair combed back and a scarf arranged with quiet precision. He paused to look at the house, then at the lighthouse, then up toward the window as if every view had been scheduled for him. Evelyn's expression tightened by one controlled degree. Graham Voss, she said. Friend of yours? No. Good. I'm running low on those. They went downstairs. By the time Caleb opened the front door, Graham Voss had reached the porch. His smile arrived before he did, warm, measured, professionally human. Mr. Whitaker, he said, removing one glove slowly before offering his hand. Graham Voss, Solvane Holdings. I hope I'm not intruding. Caleb looked at the hand, then shook it. Graham's grip was dry and confident, not too strong. Men like him never needed to prove strength with fingers. They kept proof in contracts. You are, Caleb said. Graham's smile widened, as if Caleb had made a charming rural joke. Then I'll be brief. Mara came to stand at Caleb's side, not in front of him at first. Then Graham glanced down at her, and she shifted. One step, enough to place her body between the two men. Graham lowered his gaze. Beautiful shepherd. "She knows," Caleb said. "Knows what?" "When people are complimenting her to get past me." Evelyn made a sound that might have been a cough. Graham gave a polished laugh. "Well, she may not like my coat. Dogs often distrust expensive fabric." Caleb looked at Mara, then back at Graham. "No, she just hates the smell of things polished too hard." For the first time, Graham's smile paused. Only a fraction. Then it returned, obedient as a trained horse. "I respect directness," he said. "Handy, since that's what I've got." Graham turned slightly, including Evelyn in the conversation, but keeping his focus on Caleb. "Solvang is developing a renewable wind project offshore. You may have heard some discussion in town. It would bring jobs, infrastructure investment, and long-term tax support to Winter Harbor." "I heard promises." "A fair distinction." Graham nodded gracefully. "Promises should be supported by serious offers. That is why I wanted to speak with you early. Your property is strategically located for access, survey staging, and preservation planning around the old lighthouse. Solvang would be prepared to make a generous purchase offer." "How generous?" Evelyn looked at Caleb sharply. Graham named a number. The wind moved across the porch. Somewhere below the cliff, a wave struck rock with a sound like a door closing. Caleb had imagined many things since Evelyn handed him the envelope that morning. Trouble, mold, taxes, a roof that would cost more than his van. He had not imagined a number that could buy heat, repairs, food for Mara, a bed that did not fold into a wall, and enough distance from pity to breathe. For one dangerous second, the offer did not sound like temptation. It sounded like mercy. Graham saw that. Of course he did. Men like him watched hunger the way fishermen watch tides. "No pressure," Graham said softly. "I understand this is sudden, but properties like this are difficult to maintain. The cliff alone can become a liability. We would handle all environmental review, historical considerations, and necessary legal work." "Kind of you." "Practical," Graham said. "Kindness is best when properly structured." Caleb almost laughed at that, but the sound never made it out. He looked past Graham toward Winter Harbor below, a small town with old boats, tired roofs, and people counting heating oil in gallons and prayers. Jobs would matter there. A future would matter. He knew what it was to need the next season to be kinder than the last. That was what made the man dangerous, not the money, the part that might be true. "I just got here," Caleb said. "Of course." "I haven't decided anything." "Nor should you rush." Graham reached into his coat and produced a card. "Call when you're ready, or if you need anything clarified." Mara's gaze remained fixed on him. Graham slipped the card onto the porch rail instead of handing it directly to Caleb. "Good afternoon, Mr. Whitaker. Ms. March." He put his glove back on, descended the steps, and returned to the SUV without once slipping on the snow. That seemed unreasonable to Caleb. When the vehicle rolled away, Evelyn let out a breath. "He wasted no time," she said. "No," Caleb replied. "He brought plenty of money instead." "Be careful with that kind." "With money?" "With men who make money sound like weather. Inevitable." Caleb picked up the card from the rail. It was thick, white, embossed. Graham Voss, Solvang Holdings, responsible energy for tomorrow. Mara sniffed the card once and sneezed. Caleb looked down at her. "That's going in the official minutes." By dusk, Evelyn had left Caleb with keys, documents, and a list of numbers he might need. He drove back to town for supplies and returned before full dark with canned stew, coffee, dog food, flashlight batteries, a cheap sleeping bag, and a bundle of firewood that cost too much for wood that had once been free in forests. The house changed after sunset, not into something frightening. Caleb distrusted that kind of thinking. Houses made noises, wood shifted, pipes clicked, wind found cracks and practiced music through them. Still, the stone house felt different at night. The windows reflected the room back at him, so the sea vanished, and Caleb saw himself instead. Broad shoulders under the red and black flannel, gray in his beard, eyes that looked older when caught by firelight. Mara lay near the hearth for exactly 7 minutes, then rose and went to the hallway. Caleb fed the fire. Mara. Her brass tag clicked. He found her standing by the cellar door. No. She looked at him. We are not investigating every creepy door on the first night. That's how people in bad movies get what they deserve. Mara turned away from the door and moved to the old wine cabinet against the stone wall near the back of the house. Caleb had noticed it earlier. Tall, dark wood, built in place, its glass panes dusty, its shelves mostly empty except for a few bottles too old or too unpromising to steal. Mara lowered her nose to the floorboards beneath it. She inhaled carefully. Then she pawed once at a seam in the wood. Caleb's humor thinned. He crouched beside her. "What is it?" Mara did not paw again. She lay down directly in front of the cabinet, body aligned across the floor, as if blocking an entrance no one else could see. Caleb listened. At first there was only the fire, the wind, his own breathing. Then, far below the house, beneath stone and snow, and the long, dark throat of the cliff, something answered the withdrawing tide. A faint metallic sound, not loud, not even clear. A single dull note, like iron touching rock underwater. Caleb stayed still. Mara's chest gave a low rumble. Not panic. Warning. The sound came again, softer this time, almost swallowed by the sea. Caleb placed his palm flat on the floorboards. The wood was cold. He thought of Silas Whitaker and the marked chart. Of 3 circles and a wavy line. Of a cellar no one was supposed to alter before a certain moon stood on the water. Of a company man arriving too soon with too much money and shoes that did not respect mud. Outside, the lighthouse stood dark above the house. Inside, Mara kept watch before the old wine cabinet until the fire burned low. Caleb did not sleep much that night. Near dawn, as the snow began again in small bright flakes, he opened the front door to let the cold clear his head. He expected Mara to wait behind him, as she always did in strange places. But she stepped past him, across the threshold, into the pale morning. Then she turned back and looked at him from the porch, snow gathering lightly on her muzzle, her bent ear tipped toward the sleeping lighthouse. Caleb stood inside the stone house with one hand on the blue door. For years, Mara had followed him out of rooms, out of towns, out of anything that began to resemble belonging. Now she had entered first. Now she was asking him to follow. Caleb looked at the cold hearth, the covered furniture, the old photograph on the mantel, the hallway leading toward the cellar door. This place was not a blessing, not yet. It was not safety. It was not a cure. It might be trouble shaped like inheritance and wrapped in granite. But for the first time in a long while, trouble had a roof. He stepped through the doorway after her. Behind him, the stone house held its silence. Not cursed. Waiting. By the end of Caleb's second week in the stone house, Winter Harbor had begun to treat him with a new kind of suspicion. Not the old kind, not exactly. Before, people had looked at him as if he were a bad headline left too long on a diner counter. Now they looked at him as if he were a man standing too close to a locked cabinet that everyone in town had agreed not to open. That was progress, perhaps. At least it had variety. The house under Whitaker light took work from him. Every morning, Caleb woke before dawn to the groan of the ocean below the cliff and the soft click of Mara's brass tag as she patrolled the hallway. The old place needed firewood, patched windows, a stubborn generator coaxed back into usefulness, and pipes that clanked like elderly sailors arguing in their sleep. Mara approved of the work. She followed Caleb from room to room, inspecting every repair as if she held official authority over human competence. When he fixed a loose hinge on the kitchen door, she sniffed it twice and sat down. "Passed inspection?" he asked. Mara looked away. Conditional approval? Understood. The house was still cold in its corners, still full of silences that did not belong to Caleb. Yet it no longer felt like a stranger's property. It felt like a patient old animal deciding whether he was worth trusting. On the fourth morning, a blue pickup climbed the road and stopped outside the gate. Caleb was splitting damp kindling near the shed when the driver's door opened and Nora Bell stepped out carrying a canvas bag in one hand and a covered pot in the other. She was 66, round-shouldered in the strong way of women who had lifted heavy soup pots and heavier conversations for decades. Her silver blonde hair was pinned in a loose knot that had already lost 2 battles with the wind. A red wool coat wrapped around her like a small, determined flag. Mara trotted forward, tail low, but welcoming. "Well, look at you," Nora said, bending slightly. "The only sensible creature on this cliff." Caleb rested the axe head in the snow. "Morning to you, too." Nora gave him a brisk glance. "I brought clam chowder, apple pie, and 3 unsolicited opinions." "I can pay for one of those." "You can pay by not looking like a man trying to survive on cold coffee and military regret." She marched toward the porch. Men who live on cold coffee eventually turn into telephone poles with eyebrows. Caleb followed because the pot smelled too good for pride. Inside, Nora set the food on the kitchen table without asking permission. She moved through the room as if old houses belonged to anyone willing to feed them. The blue enamel kettle caught her eye. She touched it with one finger. "Silas used to make tea in that," she said. Caleb paused. "You knew him?" "Knew of him. Knew his soup preferences. Knew he paid cash and never complained unless the chowder was too thin, in which case he looked personally betrayed by the Atlantic." That sounded familiar in a way Caleb did not like. Nora took off her gloves. Her hands were warm-looking, red from the cold, practical and strong. On her coat was a small tarnished silver pin shaped like a fish. "People say he was strange," Caleb said. "People say a lot. Half of it is weather. The other half is boredom wearing church shoes." Mara sat beside Nora's chair. Nora reached down and scratched behind the dog's bent ear. "Your girl here has better manners than most town officials." "She knows when someone has food. A sacred gift." Caleb poured coffee. Fresh this time. Nora watched him sip it and made a face. "That coffee has lost the will to live." "It matches the decor." "No, the decor has hope. Your coffee is a crime against beans." The old kitchen seemed warmer with her in it, not because of the stove, though the chowder helped. Nora had a way of filling silence without crowding it. She talked about the diner, the price of heating oil, 2 fishermen arguing over whose truck had worse brakes, and the town's general belief that snow removal was a branch of ancient prophecy. Then, as Caleb carried 2 bowls to the table, she went quiet. "My husband worked near the old cold storage on Barrow Point," she said. Caleb waited. Nora looked toward the window, where the sea flashed between bare branches. "Years ago, before they tore half of it down and called the rest historic. He started coughing in winter, then spring, then all the time. Doctors had words, lots of words. None of them came with answers." The spoon in her hand rested against the bowl. "Silas once told my Eddie that place sat on bad ground. Not unlucky ground. Bad ground." Eddie laughed. Everyone laughed at Silas eventually. Her mouth tightened, but she kept her voice light enough to keep sorrow from claiming the whole room. "It's one of Winter Harbor's favorite sports. Laugh first, wonder later." Caleb did not offer comfort. He had learned comfort given too quickly could sound like a man trying to leave the room. Instead, he said, "I'm sorry." Nora nodded once. That was enough. Mara placed her chin gently on Nora's knee. Nora blinked down at her. For a moment, the diner owner's face softened in a way that made her look younger and more tired at the same time. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "that's a dangerous animal you've got. She finds weak spots. She specializes." Nora stroked the pale streak along Mara's nose. "Don't we all?" That afternoon brought the second visitor. Father Amos Pike arrived on foot, which Caleb considered either devotion or poor planning. He was 70, tall and thin in a black coat that had seen kinder decades. A gray cardigan showed beneath it, one elbow patched in brown. His white hair stuck out from under a dark knit cap, as if the wind had been editing him. He carried a paper bag in one hand and a bundle of folded blankets under the other arm. Mara met him at the gate. "Ah," Father Amos said, stopping at once. "The household theologian." Mara sniffed his sleeve. "I bring biscuits," he told her solemnly, "for peace between nations." Caleb came down the path. "You bribing my dog, Father?" "I prefer to call it interfaith diplomacy." The priest's eyes were pale blue, kind without being soft. He had the look of a man who had heard every excuse people made for breaking and loved them without accepting the excuses as final. Inside, he placed the folded blankets near the hearth. "For the house," he said, "and for you if your pride allows textiles." "My pride is considering it." "Good. Pride catches cold faster than the body." Nora had mentioned that Amos sometimes let men sleep in the church basement during the worst nights. Not just church members, not just sober men, clean men, grateful men, or men with tidy stories. Any veteran with nowhere safe to go knew the side door behind the church might be open if the temperature dropped hard enough. Caleb did not ask how many. Amos did not volunteer. Instead, Caleb asked about Silas. The priest took off his cap and searched his coat pocket for his glasses, then frowned. "Lost them?" Caleb asked. No. I placed them in locations of spiritual significance." "Where are they now?" "Possibly the freezer at the church hall." Nora would have enjoyed that, Caleb thought. Father Amos studied the mantel photograph without glasses. Silas Whitaker was not an easy man, but easy men rarely disturb the comfortable, and the comfortable generally prefer to remain undisturbed. "He talked about bad ground," Caleb said. Amos's expression changed. "Did he?" "Nora said so, near Barrow Point. Other places, too?" The priest walked to the window. Beyond it, the old lighthouse stood against the white afternoon, not lit, but somehow still present. "Silas brought papers to town meetings," Amos said. "Maps, coastal surveys, names of companies most of us had forgotten or never knew. He claimed certain sites were used for improper disposal after the war. Industrial materials, decommissioned equipment, things people wanted gone quietly. And the town. The town needed jobs, needed docks repaired, needed men with paychecks. Silas had charts and warnings. The companies had contracts and polite representatives." Amos turned back. "Guess which one made better coffee?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Any names?" he asked. The priest hesitated. That hesitation said more than an answer. "I remember one from old papers," Amos said. "Voss Maritime Disposal. There were others. Shell companies, partnerships, names that changed coats whenever the weather did." Voss. Caleb did not move, but inside him something marked the name the way a pencil marked a map. Graham Voss's business card still sat on the kitchen shelf. Responsible energy for tomorrow. White card, clean letters, future-facing promise. The past, Caleb was beginning to learn, had excellent camouflage. That evening, after Father Amos left, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Silas's old nautical chart spread before him. Mara lay near the cellar door, not asleep. He did not yet have proof of anything. Only stories. Nora's husband, Amos's memory, a strange chart, a company name that might be coincidence, a house with a cellar the dead man had protected in language shaped like superstition. But Caleb had lived long enough to know coincidence often wore a badge and asked not to be searched. He took out the compass from Silas's desk and set it beside the chart. The brass case caught the lamplight. The needle trembled, then steadied. 3 circles. 1 wavy line. Beneath the lighthouse. Caleb found old tide tables in a drawer under the chart cabinet, bound with a cracked rubber band. Silas had written notes in the margins in precise block letters. Moon phases, pressure changes, winter lows, safe windows, unsafe windows. Caleb read them slowly, coffee cooling untouched at his elbow. The line from the will no longer sounded like poetry. The 3rd full moon of winter stands upon the water. Not a curse, a tide. The realization did not arrive with thunder. It came quietly, like a lock admitting it had always had a key. On the night of the 3rd full moon, the sky cleared. The snow stopped before sunset, leaving the world polished and breathless. The sea below the cliff shone under the moon, like melted silver poured between black stones. Every tree glittered, every fence rail wore a blade of light. Even the old lighthouse seemed less abandoned, its white tower glowing faintly as if remembering the duty of illumination. Caleb prepared without ceremony. He wore his army green t-shirt beneath the red and black flannel, then pulled on his canvas vest with the deep pockets. Into them went flashlight batteries, a multi-tool, chalk, a length of paracord, and Silas's compass. He clipped Mara's worn black harness around her shoulders. She stood still for it, solemn as a knight receiving armor in some forgotten chapel. "No heroics," Caleb said. Mara looked at him. "That applies to both of us." She sneezed once, which he chose to interpret as agreement. The house was silent when they descended to the back hallway. The cellar door waited beneath the nautical chart. Caleb opened it carefully. The stairs below were narrow and cold. Stone walls pressed close on either side. The cellar smelled of dust, old cork, mineral damp, and the faint salt breath that had troubled Mara since the first night. Caleb swept the flashlight across shelves, empty racks, old barrels, and the built-in wine cabinet fixed against the far wall. Mara went straight to it. She lowered her nose to the floorboards beneath the cabinet, then looked back. Caleb crouched. In the moon-pale dark, he saw what he had missed before. A seam too straight to be natural, a slight difference in the grain of the wood. He ran his gloved fingers along the base of the cabinet and found a shallow groove. Behind one warped lower panel, carved into the stone, were Silas's marks. 3 circles, 1 wavy line. Caleb's breath left him slowly. "Practical matters in costume," he murmured. Mara's tail moved once. The panel did not open easily. Nothing in old houses did. Caleb worked the rusted latch with the multi-tool, careful not to force the structure. The will's warning stayed in his mind. Do not demolish. Do not open by force. Wait for the moon and the water. Below the false boards was an iron door set low into the stone. It was small, almost humble, and orange with rust around the edges. Not the grand entrance to a legend, more like the service door of a secret ashamed of itself. Caleb pressed his palm against it. Cold. From beyond the iron came a faint movement of air. The door was breathing, not in any supernatural way. Caleb knew better. Pressure, tide, a hidden cavity, the ocean drawing air through stone as water withdrew from below. A body could make myth from that if it wanted. A lonely town certainly could. Still, when the next breath slipped through the door, cold and salty, carrying a trace of old metal from beneath the earth, the hair along Caleb's arms rose. Mara stepped forward. "Easy," he whispered. The latch turned with a low scrape. The iron door opened inward. Air flowed out around their boots, damp and ancient. Caleb shone the flashlight into a narrow passage of natural stone, reinforced in places by old timber and iron brackets. The floor sloped downward. Far below, water whispered. Mara entered first, then immediately looked back, not rushing, not leaving him, inviting. Caleb followed. The passage was tight enough to make his shoulders brush the walls. Water gleamed in cracks beneath his boots. The air tasted of salt and mineral cold. Somewhere deeper in the rock, the ocean moved with long, slow patience. Caleb marked the wall with chalk as they went. Old habit, old caution. He did not intend to become a story told by fishermen with too much time. Mara moved ahead, her harness handle catching the flashlight beam. Every few steps she paused and glanced back, amber eyes bright in the dark. The passage widened, then ended. Caleb stepped out into a cavern under the cliff. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. The hidden sea cave opened before him like the hollowed chest of some sleeping giant. Moonlight entered through a low gap far out toward the water, turning the tide pools silver blue. Long ribbons of kelp clung to black stone. Water moved quietly around scattered rocks, rising and falling as if the cave itself had lungs. And there, half in water and half in shadow, lay the vessel. It was small for a submarine, but still impossibly large inside that secret place. Its metal body rested at an angle, dark with age, crusted with salt, draped in seaweed. The bow pointed toward the deeper water as if it had tried to leave and failed. Rust had softened its lines, but not erased them. A narrow conning structure rose near the middle, broken and silent. Caleb knew machines. He knew military design the way some men knew scripture. This was not a modern craft, not American in its bones. Its shape carried old European severity, compact and purposeful. A transport submersible, perhaps. German designed. Repurposed, hidden, left to become reef and rumor. Mara stopped at the edge of the water. She did not bark. She did not growl. She simply stood beside Caleb, and the two of them listened to the ocean touching the metal hull with soft, patient hands. No treasure gleamed there. No golden miracle waited in the dark. The vessel looked less like adventure than confession. Caleb thought of Nora's husband coughing through winters, of Father Amos's careful pause before saying, Voss Maritime Disposal, of Silas standing alone in town meetings with papers no one wanted to read, of his own name buried under official language until even decent people stepped around him. Some things were not destroyed, he realized. They were stored. Stored in soil, stored in files, stored in bodies, stored in houses. People called cursed because cursed was easier than guilty. Mara leaned her shoulder against his leg. Caleb laid one hand on her head. "Well," he said softly, though his voice sounded small in the cave. "That's not a wine cellar." The old joke fell into the darkness and did not disturb it. He stood there until the cold found his bones, until the tide whispered against stone, until the moonlight shifted over the dead vessel and made it seem, for one strange second, like a great steel whale sleeping under the world. He felt no triumph, only the solemn weight of a door opened at last. The stone house above had not been haunted. It had been guarding a breath. And now, after all those years of silence, Caleb Whitaker had heard it. Caleb did not call the police. He did not call the Coast Guard, the town office, the state, or any agency with a seal nice enough to look important on a letterhead. For 2 days after finding the vessel under the cliff, he did what old training and older disappointment told him to do. He protected the scene, touched as little as possible, marked what he had already disturbed, and slept poorly. The stone house seemed different now. Not darker, more aware. The floorboards above the cellar no longer felt like simple wood beneath his boots. They felt like the lid of a story. Mara felt it too. She had stopped lying in front of the wine cabinet as if guarding a mystery from the world. Now she divided her watch between Caleb and the cellar door, as if she understood that a discovered secret was sometimes more dangerous than a hidden one. On the second morning, Caleb sat at the kitchen table with Silas's tide notes, the old compass, Graham Voss's white business card, and 3 cups of coffee that had each failed in a different way. Mara rested her head on his boot. "You think I'm stalling?" Caleb said. Mara did not deny it. "I'm being careful." Her eyes lifted. "All right, careful can look a lot like scared when you squint." He picked up Graham's card, "Responsible energy for tomorrow." The letters were clean enough to make the kitchen feel dusty by comparison. Caleb had once believed that truth behaved like a flare. Strike it, raise it, and decent people would see. But he had watched truth disappear inside conference rooms with polished tables and flags in the corner. He had seen a report become a rumor, a concern become insubordination, and a man's name become a convenient place to dump what others did not want to carry. Evidence needed witnesses, not friendly witnesses, useful ones. By noon, he had the name he wanted. Tessa Harrow lived 8 miles inland, past a road that wound through spruce and frozen blueberry fields. Nora had given him the address while pretending not to give advice. "She's not warm," Nora had warned, "but warm things aren't always what you need. Sometimes you need a knife that knows where to cut." Father Amos had added, "And if she throws you out, take it as a sign she was listening." So Caleb drove the Econoline with Mara beside him, the sea falling behind and the land closing in. Snow lay heavy on the fields, broken here and there by the dark bones of stone walls. Tessa's house stood at the end of a gravel lane, a low gray cabin with a greenhouse half buried in snow and bee-boxes stacked under a tarp for winter. Nothing about the place welcomed visitors. It merely acknowledged that roads existed. Before Caleb reached the porch, the door opened. Tessa Harrow stood inside, wearing a mustard-yellow field jacket over a gray turtleneck, cargo pants tucked into mud-scarred boots, and an expression that suggested the world had disappointed her early and then continued with poor consistency. Her silver hair was cut at chin length and clipped back with a metal barrette. Reading glasses hung from a cord around her neck. In one hand, she held a mug. In the other, a pencil. Mara stopped at the bottom step and sat. Tessa looked at the dog first. "Good," she said. "At least one of you knows not to trespass." Caleb removed his cap. "Mrs. Harrow?" "Ms. Harrow if we're being formal. Tessa if we're being useful. And you are the ranger living in Silas Whitaker's Cliff Museum." "Caleb." "I know." That was not comforting. "Nora said you might talk to me." "Nora says many things. Most of them come with carbohydrates." Caleb glanced at the closed door behind her. "I found something under the house." "I heard you inherited it. That's different." "I found an old submersible in a sea cave." Tessa stared at him. Wind moved snow across the porch between them. Then she took a slow sip from her mug. "Of course you did." Caleb's jaw shifted. "You don't believe me." "I don't believe anyone before lunch. After lunch, I believe measurements, photographs with scale references, chain of custody notes, and occasionally my own knees when they predict rain." "I have photographs." "Do you have contamination readings?" "No." "Sample tags?" "No." "Ventilation assessment?" "No." "I see. So what you have is a dramatic sentence." Caleb felt heat rise in his chest, not anger exactly, but the old reflex of a man whose word had once been placed on trial without being invited into the room. "I didn't come here for a sermon." "Good. I retired before I developed the patience for sermons." Tessa leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "I also retired after telling the truth about a disposal site and learning that truth without documentation is just a ghost with good intentions. Ghosts are terrible plaintiffs." Mara sighed. Not a small sigh. A full-bodied, long-suffering release of air from a creature who had apparently grown tired of watching two stubborn mammals circle the same fence. Tessa looked down at her. "You agree?" Mara blinked. "Traitor," Caleb muttered. Tessa's mouth almost smiled. "Almost. Show me what you have." Inside, her cabin smelled of wood smoke, old paper, and something herbal drying near the stove. Maps covered one wall. Not decorative maps. Working maps, scarred with pins, tabs, and colored lines. Filing boxes sat beneath them in disciplined stacks. On the table, Caleb laid out his phone photographs, Silas's copied tide notes, and rough sketches he had made of the cave entrance and vessel. Tessa did not gasp. She did not whisper. She did not perform belief. She put on her glasses. Then she became precise. She asked when he entered, what the tide height had been, how much airflow came from the iron door, whether he noticed odors, whether Mara showed avoidance, alerting, or curiosity, whether Caleb touched any containers, whether there were markings on the vessel, labels on crates, corrosion colors, pooled liquids, powder residue, disturbed sediment. He answered as well as he could. When he showed her the picture of Silas's carved symbol, 3 circles and a wavy line, Tessa's pencil stopped. "Again," she said. Caleb swiped back to the image. Tessa leaned closer. "That mark appears on one of Silas's complaint copies." "You have Silas's papers?" "I have copies of things people were hoping would become boring enough to vanish." She looked at him over her glasses. "Boring is where bad work likes to hide." For the first time, Caleb saw something in her face that was not suspicion, not trust, recognition. She stood and crossed to a metal file cabinet. The drawer opened with a reluctant shriek. She pulled a folder from the back, then another, then a manila envelope with the corner chewed by age. On the table she spread old letters, coastal maps, municipal minutes, and photocopied complaints bearing Silas Whitaker's name in careful block letters. A few had been stamped received, many had not, some were marked incomplete. One had a note in the margin, unsupported claim. Caleb stared at that phrase. 2 words could be a shovel. They could bury a man while sounding tidy. Tessa tapped one map. Barrow Point, cold storage, fill work in the late 40s and 50s, complaints in the 70s, respiratory clusters, livestock issues, groundwater odor, all dismissed or filed under insufficient data. Nora's husband worked there. "I know." Caleb looked up. Tessa's voice softened, but only by a fraction. "Everyone who pays attention knows. Paying attention is not the same as being allowed to prove anything." The room fell quiet except for the wood stove ticking. Mara stood and came closer to the table. She did not put her paws up. She only pressed her shoulder against Caleb's leg. Tessa watched that. "She's trained?" She was. "Detection?" "Explosives originally. Some hazardous material conditioning. Mostly discipline, scent work, controlled alerting." "Will she indicate reliably?" Caleb's hand settled on Mara's head. "She won't give you a lab result." "I did not ask if she was a lab." "She'll tell me when something is wrong." Tessa studied the dog for a long moment. Mara met her gaze calmly, her bent ear tilted, her amber eyes serious and unamused. Finally, Tessa said, "All right." Caleb frowned. "All right what?" "All right, Ranger, I'll look." "I'm not asking you to take risks." "No, you're asking me to take you seriously. That is riskier." They went to the cliff house near low tide the following morning. Tessa arrived with a field bag, gloves, a respirator, sample containers, a headlamp, flagging tape, and the brisk annoyance of a woman who had not expected to be proved interested. Caleb wore his canvas vest. Mara wore her old black harness. Before they entered the cellar, Tessa turned to him. "Rules. Nobody opens sealed containers. Nobody scrapes unknown residue. Nobody pretends courage is a substitute for ventilation. If I say back out, we back out. If the dog alerts, we treat that as a warning, not a treasure hunt. Caleb nodded. Agreed. You say that too quickly. I've been yelled at by better. I doubt that. Mara looked between them and gave another tired sigh. The iron door breathed cold air as before. Caleb opened it carefully. Tessa crouched, checked the airflow with a small strip of light plastic, then made a note. Not mystical, she said. Disappointed? Relieved. Mysticism is harder to cite. They descended. In daylight, with better lamps, the passage seemed less mythic and more engineered. Old braces supported natural stone. Rusted brackets marked places where someone had cared enough to make the route last. Silas, Caleb thought, or someone before him. The dead left fingerprints in strange materials, iron, pencil, stubbornness. The cave opened around them. Tessa stopped at the sight of the submersible. For once, she had no immediate comment. Moonlight no longer filled the cavern, but gray winter light entered through the low sea gap, enough to show the vessel's curved back, the seaweed draped across it, and the old metal dulled by decades of salt. Water lapped quietly against the hull. Mara moved first. She approached the exposed side of the vessel with slow, deliberate steps. Caleb watched her body language. Head low, breathing measured, ears forward. She sniffed near a cluster of sealed metal cylinders and stopped. Her body stiffened. Then she turned her head sharply aside, huffed twice, and backed half a step. Not fear. Avoidance. Caleb raised a hand. There. Tessa was already writing. What did you see? She asked. Odor rejection. Controlled retreat. She's telling me not to close distance. Tessa nodded. Good dog. Mara did not wag. She accepted professional respect as her due. They did not open the cylinders. Instead, Tessa photographed them with a ruler beside the markings. Caleb held the light. On 2 containers, beneath rust and salt crust, stenciled letters remained faintly visible. Not enough to understand fully, but enough to suggest military surplus codes and shipping batches. Tessa's expression tightened. They climbed onto the stable side of the vessel only after Tessa tested surfaces with her boot and Caleb secured a rope line. Inside, the compartment smelled of old metal, trapped air, and wet canvas. The space was cramped, more transport than combat vessel. Caleb felt no thrill entering it. If anything, the narrow interior reminded him of a confession booth built by engineers who did not believe in forgiveness. Near the rear bulkhead, behind a corroded equipment locker, they found the box. It was not large, dark green, waterproof, secured under a bracket that had nearly rusted through. Caleb freed it gently while Tessa photographed each step. The latch resisted, then gave. Inside lay oil-wrapped packets, a folded chart tube, and a journal sealed in waxed cloth. Silas Whitaker's name was written on the first page. Caleb did not touch the writing at first. He had spent his life thinking of his mother's father as an absence, a strange old man shaped by rumors. Seeing the name in ink changed him slightly, not in a sentimental way, more like hearing someone knock from inside a wall. Tessa put on clean gloves and turned the pages. Dates, tides, coordinates, vessel descriptions, company names, complaints, meetings with officials, notes on unexplained fill operations near working-class neighborhoods and coastal storage sites. Repeated references to Voss Maritime Disposal, sometimes under that name, sometimes under partnerships that seemed designed to shed skins. The past had paperwork. It always did. One page included a map with red pencil marks along the coast. Barrow Point was circled. Tessa's face lost color. "That's the cold storage," Caleb said. "Yes." "Nora's eddy." "Yes." For a few seconds, the cavern seemed to hold more than salt air. It held a woman's long nights beside a coughing husband. It held Silas at town meetings, being dismissed with polite phrases. It held soil turned over and covered again. It held the strange patience of harm that did not announce itself, only waited in lungs, wells, ledgers, and grief. Caleb looked away first. There are moments when a man understands that anger is too small for what he is feeling. Tessa carefully slid the journal into a protective sleeve. We document, we duplicate, and we do not get theatrical. I wasn't planning a parade. Good. Parades contaminate evidence. Caleb almost smiled despite himself. By late afternoon, they had enough photographs and notes to begin building a record, but not enough to expose anything safely. Tessa insisted on storing duplicates in separate places. One digital copy with her, one encrypted drive hidden at the house, one sealed envelope to be placed with Evelyn March if needed. Paranoid? Caleb asked. Experienced? When they emerged from the cellar, daylight had turned blue. The house above felt ordinary for one strange minute. Kitchen, hearth, table, muddy boots. Then Caleb saw the old journal lying in its sleeve, and ordinary vanished. The following day, he met June Larkin at the diner. He had not wanted to. Nora arranged it by saying, "You need a reporter," in the tone of someone saying, "You need stitches." Then she added, "And don't make that face. Nobody likes medicine." June sat in the back booth with a coffee she had forgotten to drink. She was 42, small and quick-looking, with chestnut hair tied half back and a notebook already open. A camera strap crossed her navy coat. Her green-gray eyes sharpened when Caleb entered, then softened in a way he did not trust. She had written about him once, not cruelly. That might have been easier. The article had been careful, official, full of phrases like disputed record and military source. It had not called him guilty. It had merely built a fence around him and let readers decide not to cross. Caleb slid into the booth across from her. Mara settled under the table, pressing against his boot. June looked at the dog. "Hello, Mara." Mara did not respond. "Smart," Caleb said. "She reads local journalism." June accepted the hit without flinching. "I deserved that." "I wasn't offering absolution." "I wasn't asking for it." Nora appeared with coffee, looked between them, and said, "Wonderful. 2 people allergic to apologies. This should be nourishing." She left before either could answer. Caleb placed 3 printed photographs on the table, not the most sensitive ones. Tessa would have skinned him with a footnote if he had done that. The images showed the carved mark, the old chart, and one exterior view of the vessel from inside the cave. June's face changed as she looked. Like Tessa, she did not perform belief, but unlike Tessa, she looked wounded by it. "You found this under Whitaker Light?" "Yes." "And Silas documented disposal sites?" "We're verifying." "We?" "Tessa Harrow." June looked up sharply. "Tessa agreed to work with you?" "Eventually." "That's more convincing than the submarine." Caleb leaned back. "Good to know my credibility is ranked below rust." June touched the edge of one photograph. "Why bring this to me?" "I'm not bringing it to you yet. I'm showing you enough to decide whether you're still the kind of reporter who prints what powerful people hand her." There it was. The booth went still. June looked down at her notebook. For a second she seemed younger, not by years, but by regret. "When I wrote about you," she said slowly, "I trusted the documents I had." "So did I?" She met his eyes then. That struck harder than an apology. "I can't undo it," she said. "No." "But I can be more careful now." Caleb wanted to say something sharp. Sharp things were easy and often satisfying. Instead, he looked at Mara under the table. Her head rested on her paws, but her eyes were open, watching both of them as if patience were a duty she had accepted on behalf of the species. Careful would be new, Caleb said. June nodded. Then we'll start there. He gathered the photographs. Nothing public yet. Understood. No names printed without verification. Agreed? No turning Silas into a lunatic prophet or me into some wounded hero for weekend readers. June's mouth tightened. Agreed. And Mara gets final editorial approval. For the first time, June almost smiled. That may improve the paper. Under the table, Mara's tail tapped once against the floor. That evening, Tessa returned to the stone house with copies of old complaint records and a warning in her face. They spread everything across the kitchen table: Silas's journal pages, maps, Nora's Barrow Point connection, photographs of vessel markings, municipal records, and the first hints of corporate lineage between old disposal companies and the modern structure around Solvane. Tessa drew 3 columns on a legal pad. Past, land, motive. She tapped the first column. We have the past, not complete, but real. Then the second. We need present-day land data, current surveys, contamination reports, altered assessments, anything tying those old sites to today's development footprint. Finally, the third. And we need motive. Why Solvane wants your house so badly. Not speculation, proof, access rights, survey needs, liability exposure, internal concern, something. Caleb looked at the columns. 3 doors, none easy. Mara lay beside the hearth, watching the fire with tired golden eyes. The brass tag on her collar caught the light each time she breathed. So, finding the vessel was the easy part, Caleb said. Tessa capped her pen. Yes, she said. The dead leave clues. The living hire lawyers. Outside, the lighthouse stood dark in the winter night. Inside, Caleb looked at Silas's journal and understood that the cave had not given him an answer. It had handed him a burden with instructions. Graham Voss returned to the stone house on a morning so bright it seemed almost dishonest. The snow had stopped overnight, leaving North Lantern Road clean and hard beneath a blue winter sky. Sunlight struck the lighthouse and made its dead glass shine as if the old tower had remembered how to pretend. Down below, Winter Harbor looked gentle from a distance. Smoke rising, boats rocking in their slips, gulls walking over the ice with the grave stupidity of retired kings. Caleb was stacking firewood beside the shed when the black SUV came up the road. This time, Graham was not alone. A second vehicle followed, a dark sedan, polished clean despite the salt and slush. From it stepped a woman in a tailored coat with a leather folder held flat against her ribs. She had the calm, sealed face of someone paid to keep other people's storms out of courtrooms. Graham emerged from the SUV wearing a charcoal overcoat, black gloves, and the same pleasant expression Caleb had begun to dislike for its excellent maintenance. Mara stood at Caleb's left side. She did not growl. She did not step forward. She simply watched. "Mr. Whitaker," Graham called, as if they were neighbors meeting beside a garden fence. "Thank you for receiving us." "I didn't," Caleb said. "You drove up." Graham smiled. "Then, thank you for not sending us away immediately." The woman beside him adjusted her folder. "Carolyn Mettler, counsel for Solvane Holdings?" Caleb nodded once. "Congratulations." She blinked. Graham's smile warmed by half a degree. "We hope to present a revised offer," Graham said. "More comprehensive, more responsive to the property's unique history." "That's one way to say higher." "It is higher." They moved to the porch because Caleb did not invite them inside. The stone house stood behind him, silent and white, like an old witness refusing to raise its hand yet. The sea wind pressed at their coats. Mara sat between Caleb and the door, her brass tag resting against her chest. Caroline opened the folder. The papers inside were beautiful. Not just organized. Beautiful. Clean tabs, colored maps, financial projections, community benefit summaries, environmental language polished smooth enough to skate on. There were renderings of sleek turbines offshore, workers in hard hats smiling at equipment, local tax revenue charts, dock improvements, scholarships, road repairs, a proposed harbor resilience fund. Solvane had made hope into a brochure. Graham spoke gently, almost reverently. Winter Harbor has been overlooked for too long. A responsible offshore wind project could bring stable employment, infrastructure, and long-term investment, not charity. Partnership? Caleb said nothing, because the worst part was that some of it sounded true. He knew the town's winter math. He had watched fishermen patch gear they could not afford to replace. He had seen Nora count propane deliveries under her breath. He had seen old men in the diner hold their coffee cups with both hands, less for warmth than for something to hold. Hope did not have to be false to be dangerous. Sometimes the truest bait cut deepest. Graham placed a purchase proposal on the porch rail. The number had grown, not a little. Caleb stared at it longer than he meant to. With that money, he could fix the house properly, or leave it, buy land inland, pay old debts, replace the van, care for Mara if age began taking tolls she could not explain, live without choosing between dog food and diesel. For a moment, the amount did not look like greed. It looked like a door. Mara leaned against his leg. Not hard, just enough. Caroline said, "The offer includes relocation support and a discretionary charitable donation to a veteran housing nonprofit of your choice." Caleb looked up. There it was, a hand on the wound professionally placed. Graham's voice remained soft. "We recognize your service, Mr. Whitaker." Caleb felt something in him go very still. "No," he said, "you recognize a pressure point." The air cooled. Graham's face did not change, but the pleasantness became thinner, stretched over bone. "I assure you," Caroline said, "there is no intent." Intent is what people talk about when consequences start looking ugly. Graham put one gloved hand gently over the folder as if calming the papers. "Caleb, may I call you Caleb?" "No." "Mr. Whitaker, then. You have every right to take time, but I would urge you to consider the town as well as the house. Some opportunities do not come twice." Caleb glanced past him at the harbor below. "Neither do some mistakes." Graham gave a small, sad smile. "That depends on whether one can tell the difference." When they left, Caroline carried the folder, but the proposal remained in Caleb's hand. Mara watched the SUV until it vanished below the curve of the road. Only then did she huff. "Yeah," Caleb said. "I heard him too." By afternoon, Winter Harbor had heard something. Not the truth. The truth was still inside Tessa's folders, Silas's journal, June's careful questions, and a cave that breathed beneath the house. What the town heard was simpler. Caleb Whitaker was standing in the way of the Solvane project. Simple stories traveled faster because they packed light. At the diner, conversation shortened when Caleb walked in. Not vanished, just shortened. A sentence clipped in half. A laugh folded away. Nora set chowder in front of him with more force than necessary, as if daring the room to object to soup. Mara lay beneath the booth, her body pressed against his boots. An older fisherman named Roy Danner sat 3 stools down at the counter. His face was red from weather, his hands knotted from rope and cold. He had never been unkind to Caleb, never kind either. He belonged to the large nation of men who survived by keeping their opinions practical. Roy turned his coffee cup slowly. "Lot of folks could use work," he said. The diner quieted without admitting it. Caleb looked at him. "I know. Harbor's not what it was." "I know that too." Roy nodded, eyes on his cup. "Pride don't pay for heating oil." Nora froze behind the counter. No one moved. The words did not strike Caleb like an insult. Insults were easy. These landed heavier because they carried truth in one hand and accusation in the other. He thought of Graham's proposal, the clean charts, the veterans' donation, the harbor fund, the number large enough to make suffering look irresponsible. "No," Caleb said quietly. "It doesn't." Roy looked up then, perhaps surprised Caleb had not argued. Caleb stood, left money for the chowder, and touched 2 fingers to Mara's leash. Nora called after him, "You didn't finish." "I'm not as hungry as I thought." "That's because you're full of mule." He almost smiled, but it did not reach. Outside, the cold took his face in both hands. Mara did not pull toward the van or the stone house. Instead, she turned down the sidewalk toward the church. "Mara," Caleb said. She kept walking. He followed because there were worse things than being led by a dog with better instincts than most committees. The church basement smelled of old wood, coffee, wool blankets, and floor cleaner. Father Amos was there, sorting donated coats at a folding table. His glasses were perched on top of his head, though he was searching the table for them with growing theological concern. "Looking for these?" Caleb asked. Father Amos touched his head, found the glasses, and sighed. "The Lord works through mockery." Mara walked past them to a row of cots stacked against the wall. Beside them sat cardboard boxes labeled socks, gloves, thermals. A kettle hummed in the corner. A bulletin board held phone numbers, shelter contacts, medical clinic hours, and a handwritten note. No questions before coffee. Caleb looked around. "How many sleep here?" he asked. "Depends how cold the night is," Amos said. Cold is a very efficient organizer. "Veterans?" Some fishermen between boats, some men who lost work, some who lost family, some who lost the habit of explaining themselves. Caleb's eyes moved over the folded blankets. Mara sat beside a cot and looked at him. The message was not mysterious. It was worse. It was clear. The fight was not only under the house. It was here, too, among men who needed warmth more immediately than justice, men who might choose any promise that came with a paycheck because principles did not thaw fingers. Father Amos picked up a coat, checked the zipper, and spoke without looking at Caleb. "People are not wrong to want work." "I know. And you are not wrong to want truth." "That seems less popular." "Truth often needs poor marketing before it matures." Caleb exhaled. "What if I'm stopping something good?" The priest finally looked at him. His pale eyes were tired and kind. "Then make sure you are not. But if something good requires silence about something harmful, it is not good yet. It is only well-dressed." The words stayed with Caleb as Mara led him next to the harbor. Not the cliff, not the cellar, not the cave where the old vessel waited like a steel memory. She led him through the living town, past 2 men mending nets with red hands, past Nora's diner windows glowing against the snow, past a woman loading groceries into an old car while checking her receipt twice, past the bait shed where the econoline still looked like a tired animal refusing to lie down, past the small public bench where a man Caleb had seen once in Amos's basement sat smoking into the wind, his backpack tucked under his knees. Mara stopped at each place long enough for Caleb to see it. Not dramatically. She was not guiding him to clues. She was guiding him back to people. By the time they reached the end of the pier, the sky had begun to soften toward evening. Fishing boats knocked gently against their lines. The harbor ice glowed pink. Caleb stood with his hands in the pockets of his worn flannel, feeling the proposal folded inside one of them like a small, expensive animal. Mara leaned against him. "You think I forgot what we're fighting for," he said. She looked up. "Yeah," he murmured. "Maybe I did?" That same afternoon, 2 counties away in a temporary Solvane field office, Claire Dunham opened a report that was not supposed to bother her. It did anyway. Claire was 42, an environmental engineer with a neat dark bob, tired brown eyes, and a habit of tucking her hair behind her ear whenever numbers refused to behave. She had joined Solvang because she believed clean energy was not a slogan, but a necessary repair. She believed in turbine efficiency, coastal resilience, carbon math, and field data that did not care who owned the conference room. She did not believe in ghosts, cursed houses, or men with military scandals muttering over old maps. At least she had not planned to. Her office was a rented room above a marine supply store in Bar Harbor, with a view of a parking lot and a printer that expressed its suffering at irregular intervals. On her desk lay soil reports, seabed surveys, shoreline access diagrams, and a binder labeled North Lantern Acquisition Priority. That label had bothered her before. Priority was not unusual, but the urgency around the Whitaker property felt excessive. The site was useful, yes. Strategically helpful, yes. But the internal language around it had begun to sound less like planning and more like containment. Claire compared the public presentation report with an earlier draft. 3 sample locations were missing. She frowned, tucked her hair behind her ear, and checked again. The missing samples were not dramatic on their own. Elevated anomalies, inconclusive markers, recommended follow-up. Not proof of a catastrophe, not enough to stop a project. But their coordinates sat near the old coastal fill zones Silas Whitaker had marked on documents June Larkin had quietly asked about in a carefully worded email. Claire leaned back. The printer groaned in the corner like an old beast dreaming of rebellion. She opened the metadata on the revised report. The samples had not been removed by mistake. They had been excluded after legal review. Claire's mouth went dry. She wanted, very badly, for there to be a reasonable explanation. There were always reasonable explanations. Data quality issues, chain of custody problems, duplicate sampling, preliminary findings not ready for release. Claire had used those phrases herself when they were true, but truth had a sound. So did avoidance. This sounded like a door being closed softly. Her phone buzzed. A message from Graham's office. Need updated environmental assurance language for community packet. Keep concise. No unnecessary historical context. Claire stared at the words unnecessary historical context. Then she looked at the excluded sample coordinates again. For the first time, Caleb Whitaker did not look in her mind like an angry man clinging to a theory. He looked like a man standing near a door someone else wanted locked. That evening, June sat alone in her car outside the town library, engine running, laptop open on the passenger seat. She had spent the day digging through old archives, contractor names, disposal permits, defense subcontracting records, and military-adjacent transport companies that had changed names so often they seemed less like businesses than snakes molting in paperwork. The thread was thin, too thin for print. But it existed. A contractor tied to Caleb's old case had once shared liability coverage with a logistics subsidiary later absorbed into a Voss-controlled holding structure. Not Solvang directly, not a neat villain signature, more like roots under frozen ground, touching where no one walking above would think to look. June rubbed her eyes. The old article she had written about Caleb sat open in another tab. She read one sentence 3 times. According to sources familiar with the investigation, Whitaker's judgment had previously been questioned. She remembered writing it. She remembered thinking it was careful, balanced, safe. Now it looked like a blade with gloves on. A soft knock sounded on the passenger window. June jumped, then saw an envelope tucked beneath her windshield wiper. No one stood nearby. Across the lot, a dark compact car pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the snowy street. June stepped out, took the envelope, and returned to the driver's seat. Inside was a printed spreadsheet excerpt, 3 pages of internal notes, and a sticky note with one sentence written in tight, controlled handwriting. They knew the North Lantern data was abnormal before the second offer. No signature. But one page bore a faint footer: C. Dunham, Environmental Review Draft. June sat very still. The heater blew warm air against her knees. Outside, the library windows glowed yellow. Snow began again, soft and innocent, covering tire tracks as fast as the world could make them. She called Caleb. He answered on the fourth ring. "What?" he said. "No hello." Of course. June looked at the papers in her lap. Her pulse had gone quick and cold. "You need to come to the diner," she said. "Now?" "Yes." "Why?" She looked at the sticky note again. Because the truth just grew teeth. At the stone house, Caleb stood in the kitchen with the phone to his ear. Mara lifted her head from the hearth. He did not know yet what June held. He only knew that the night outside had gone very quiet, and somewhere below the floorboards, beneath stone, tide, and old iron, the hidden cave waited with its dead vessel and its unfinished testimony. Caleb looked at Mara. She was already standing. The survey crew arrived with permits. That was what made it worse. If a man came to the cliff at midnight with a pry bar and a guilty face, the town would know what to call him. Trouble had old shapes everyone understood. But the trucks that came up North Lantern Road wore company decals, safety cones, reflective tape, and laminated paperwork clipped to boards. Their equipment looked expensive. Their boots looked approved. Their language carried the clean smell of liability insurance. They said they were conducting a limited geological assessment for offshore infrastructure planning. They said the work was temporary. They said there was no risk to private property. They said many things that morning, all of them smooth enough to slide under a locked door. Caleb watched from the porch of the stone house while 3 men unloaded tripods, ground sensors, and a portable vibration unit near the upper shoulder of the cliff. The snow around them had been packed down by tires. Yellow flags marked points along the rock line. Beyond them, the old lighthouse stood silent, its white tower bright against the hard winter sky. Mara stood beside Caleb, her body tense but controlled. "Easy," he murmured. She did not take her eyes off the equipment. Down by the access road, Mason Rourke argued with a man in a white hard hat. Caleb knew Mason mostly by reputation and by the shape of his back in bad weather. He was 50, broad through the chest, shorter than Caleb, but built like a dock post that had decided to grow a mustache. His hair was dark blonde, shot with gray, his cheeks always red from wind, and his thick gray-gold mustache gave him the look of a lighthouse keeper who had lost patience with romanticism. He ran Winter Harbor's volunteer coastal rescue team and trusted rope, weather, knots, and tides more than people's explanations. He did not trust Caleb. That much had been obvious from the beginning. Mason had heard the old military story like everyone else. To him, Caleb was a man with trouble tied to his name, now standing in the middle of another town problem and calling it principle. But that morning, Mason was not looking at Caleb. He was looking at the ground. "You're too close to the hollow rock," Mason told the hard-hat man. The man glanced at a tablet. "Our permits authorize temporary testing in this zone." "Your permits don't know this cliff." "Our team completed preliminary mapping." Mason pointed toward the lighthouse. "And I've pulled 3 tourists, 2 fishermen, and 1 drunk cousin of mine off this rock in winter. That east shoulder rings hollow after a freeze. You put vibration there, you may not like what answers." The hard hat man's smile was polite in the way Graham Voss's smile was polite, built to survive disagreement. "We appreciate local knowledge," he said. "No," Mason said. "You appreciate using the phrase." Caleb almost liked him for that. Almost. By noon, Tessa Harrow had arrived at the stone house, carrying a field bag and the expression of a woman who considered permits a poor substitute for wisdom. June Larkin came 10 minutes later with her camera, recorder, and a scarf wound twice around her neck. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her eyes were sharper than they had been at the diner days before. Claire Dunham had sent June a warning at dawn. Survey schedule advanced. North Lantern vibration testing today. I do not know why. Be careful. The message had come too late to stop the crew from arriving, but not too late to sharpen everyone's fear. Tessa read it twice at Caleb's kitchen table and then placed her glasses on her head instead of around her neck, which Caleb had learned meant she was either worried or about to make someone regret using vague language. "We need a complete visual record before anything changes," she said. "Exterior cave mouth if accessible, cellar entrance, vessel overview, container markings, structural supports. No sampling today, no opening anything, no hero nonsense." Caleb looked at Mara. "She means you." Mara ignored him. "She means you," June said. Tessa pointed her pen at both humans. "I mean everyone with a pulse and an ego." Caleb did not like the timing. The survey crew above the cliff, the warning from Claire, the tide tables spread across his kitchen table. All of it felt like walking into a room after hearing a floorboard creak. But evidence had its own weather. Wait too long, and it changed. The plan was simple. Tessa and June would document the cellar entrance and Silas's marks first. Caleb and Mara would go ahead into the passage, confirm the cave remained stable after the first round of equipment placement, then bring them down only if the route looked safe. It was cautious, reasonable, almost enough to make Caleb distrust it. Before he opened the iron door behind the old wine cabinet, he looked at Mara. No unnecessary bravery. Her amber eyes held his. "I'm serious." She gave a tiny huff, as if to say seriousness was one of his less efficient hobbies. The door breathed cold air into the cellar. Not strong. Not wrong. The tide was still falling, though it would turn within the hour. Caleb checked his watch, marked the time, and clipped Mara's leash to her harness. They descended. The stone passage felt different with the survey crew working somewhere above them. Caleb could hear nothing at first except water far below and the soft pad of Mara's paws. Still, the rock had a faint uneasiness to it. Not sound exactly. A pressure. A memory of vibration traveling through stone. He stopped midway and placed one gloved hand against the wall. Mara stopped too. A faint tremor passed under his palm. Small, then gone. "Yeah," he whispered. "I felt it." They continued toward the cave. Behind them, in the cellar, Tessa's voice carried faintly through the passage as she told June not to step on a flagged board unless she wanted to be remembered in an incident report. June murmured something Caleb could not hear. Tessa replied, "Good. Fear improves footwork." The cave opened ahead, dim and silver gray. The old submersible lay where it had lain for decades, half in shadow, half in water, its curved metal back draped with kelp. The tide was low enough for the central rock shelf to show. Water lapped gently around the vessel. Everything seemed still. Too still, Caleb thought. Mara moved several steps ahead, then froze. Her nose lifted, not toward the vessel, toward the ceiling. Caleb heard the tremor a second later. It began as a low shiver through the stone, like a giant clearing its throat in another room. Dust whispered down from cracks overhead. A few pebbles ticked against the rock shelf. The vessel answered with a dull metallic groan, deep and tired, as if the old steel resented being woken. "Mara," Caleb said. She turned back. The passage behind them gave a sharp crack. Not loud enough to be thunder, loud enough to change the world. Caleb ran. Mara sprang beside him. They reached the mouth of the passage just as a section of old rock and timber support slumped inward, not a full collapse, not a cinematic roar, but enough. Enough stone, enough splintered brace, enough shifted earth to block the narrow way back. Dust filled the air. Caleb coughed once into his sleeve and held up a hand for Mara to stay clear. He waited for more movement. None came. The blockage settled with small ticking sounds. From the other side, faint and muffled, Tessa shouted his name. "I'm here!" Caleb called. The rock swallowed half his voice. June shouted something. Then Tessa again. He could not make out the words. Caleb pulled his flashlight and examined the blockage. No opening wide enough for his shoulders. No safe way to move the larger stones without bringing more down. He put a hand against the jammed timber. It shifted slightly under pressure. Bad. Very bad. Mara whined low. "I know." The water behind them slapped the rock. Caleb turned. The tide had begun to return. For a few seconds, he simply stood there, the facts arranging themselves with cruel patience. Blocked passage, rising tide, unknown upper vents, old vessel, cold water, limited light, one dog trusting him more than he deserved. He took a breath, then another. Panic was a tax. He could not afford it. He checked his watch, then took chalk from his vest and marked the current waterline on the rock. He wrote the time beside it. The pencil of his mind began drawing numbers. Rate of rise, distance to higher shelf, probable tide height, remaining battery life, air movement. Old skills returned. Not like glory, but like tools pulled from a drawer. Mara watched him. "Still with me?" he asked. Her tail moved once. "Good. You keep me honest." He moved them to a higher ledge near the vessel. The old metal hull gave occasional soft sounds under the changing pressure, not collapsing, only complaining. Water crept into low channels. It made no dramatic rush. That was part of the terror. It was patient. Patient things won if men wasted time. Caleb tested the cave walls with his light. There were cracks, dark seams, mineral stains. He remembered the faint airflow from the iron door. The cave had to breathe somewhere else. It had breathed long before he came. The flashlight beam caught something high above and to the left. A pale flicker. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Again, not light from outside exactly. Something white moving through a slit in the stone. Snow. Tiny flakes dropping through a narrow vent, each one bright for a second in his beam before vanishing into the dark. Mara had seen it too. She moved beneath the crack, nose lifted, then placed both front paws against the rock. The opening was high, reachable only by a sloping shelf and a crawl through jagged stone. Too narrow for Caleb, perhaps wide enough for Mara if she squeezed through without the leash. "No," Caleb said before he meant to. Mara looked at him. He knew that look. He had seen it years ago when Aaron Pike stood at the edge of a training field under hard white lights, giving Mara a command she did not want to obey. Stay, leave, search, return. Dogs learned commands, but grief taught them exceptions. Mara had lost one handler. Caleb knew with a sudden ache behind his ribs that she had no intention of leaving another. The water climbed over the mark he had made. He checked his watch. Not enough time to wait for Tessa to solve the blockage from the cellar. Not enough air for stubbornness. Not enough warmth for pride. He unclipped the leash from Mara's harness. She stepped back immediately, refusing the meaning before he gave it words. "Mara." Her ears flattened. "Come here." She came, but slowly. Caleb knelt on the cold stone. Water touched one knee through the fabric of his pants. He placed both hands on either side of her head, feeling the warm life beneath the thick fur, the old scar at the bent ear, the steady intelligence of her gaze. For a moment, he was not in the cave. He was in a smaller room years before, taking her leash from Aaron with the strange terror of receiving something precious from a man who could no longer carry it. He remembered saying, "I've got her." He remembered Aaron answering, "No, Caleb, let her get you too." He had not understood then. He did now. Mara pressed her forehead into his chest. "I know," he whispered. His voice nearly failed him, so he made it softer instead. "Go, girl. This time, protect me by leaving me for a little while." She did not move. "Find Nora. Find people. Go." Mara gave one sharp, broken sound, not a bark, not a whine, something between refusal and prayer. Caleb kissed the pale streak on her nose. Go. This time she obeyed. She climbed the sloping stone with the quick, careful strength of her breed. Caleb lifted her once at the hardest ledge, guiding her front paws toward the vent. She squeezed into the dark seam, shoulders twisting, harness scraping rock. For one terrible second, she stuck. Then she pushed through, disappeared, and the cave became too large without her. Caleb stood alone under the cliff while water climbed around his boots. Above the cave, Mara emerged into snow and wind. The vent opened on a narrow shelf below the lighthouse, hidden behind winter grass and ice-glazed stone. She pulled herself free, shook once, and immediately lowered her nose to the ground. For any ordinary dog, the world outside would have been chaos. Salt, snow, diesel, spruce, human tracks, cold iron, gulls, fear. But Mara knew her task. Not by words alone, by bond, by the shape of Caleb's voice when he told her to go. She ran. Across the upper cliff path, past the survey flags snapping in the wind, past two startled workers who shouted but did not catch her. Down North Lantern Road, paws striking snow, breath white, harness dark against her gold and black coat. She did not run toward the van, she ran toward the town. Nora saw her first. The diner door opened as a customer left, and Mara burst inside with a blast of cold air and snow. Conversation stopped. One spoon clattered against a bowl. Nora turned from the counter. "Mara?" the dog barked. Once, twice, sharp, urgent, nothing like her usual controlled silence. Then she seized the end of Nora's cream scarf in her teeth and pulled. "Hey now!" Mara pulled harder. Nora's face changed. In 1 second, all the jokes fell away and left the woman beneath. The widow, the keeper of warm food, the woman who knew when love arrived carrying bad news. "Caleb," she said. Mara barked again. Nora moved. She called Father Amos first because his church phone tree worked faster than the town office. Then Tessa. Then June. Then Mason Rourke. Mason answered with wind in the background. "What?" "It's Caleb," Nora said. Mara came alone. A pause. "Where?" "North Lantern." Another pause, shorter. "I'm moving." To his credit, Mason did not ask whether Caleb had caused the problem. He grabbed his rescue coat, his radio, and 2 men from the volunteer station. By the time he reached the cliff road, Father Amos was already there in a black coat and mismatched gloves, directing cars away as if traffic control were a sacrament. June arrived with her camera but kept it down until Tessa snapped, "Document the equipment positions, not the drama." Nora stood near the gate with Mara pressed against her leg, one hand gripping the dog's harness. Mason took in the scene quickly. Survey equipment near the east shoulder, fresh vibration marks in packed snow, the stone house, the cliff line, the blocked cellar access reported by Tessa, and Mara's repeated pull toward the upper slope below the lighthouse. He looked at the dog. "You know where?" Mara strained forward. Mason looked at Tessa. "Is that dog reliable?" Tessa said, "more than most consultants." "Good enough." They followed Mara. The rescue was not graceful. Real rescues rarely were. Men slipped, radios crackled. Someone cursed softly and apologized to Father Amos, who said he had heard worse during bingo. Ropes were anchored to the lighthouse base and 2 iron posts near the old fence. Lights cut through the snow in yellow beams. Mason found the vent shelf, then the secondary crack leading down toward the cave roof. He also found something else. Fresh disturbance in the snow. Not from Mara. Not from rescue boots. A line of small vibration stakes placed closer to the hollow rock than the permit map allowed. Mason's jaw tightened. "June," he called, "photograph these before anyone steps here." June did. Below, Caleb heard the first muffled shout through stone and thought, absurdly, that it sounded like the world remembering his name. Then a rope dropped through the widened upper crack. Mason's voice followed, distorted but solid. "Whitaker, you alive enough to be useful?" Caleb looked at the water around his thighs. "Depends who's asking." "That sounds like yes." Caleb almost laughed. It hurt his chest. It took time, too much time, and exactly enough. Mason's crew widened the upper access carefully. Tessa shouted warnings about structural stress. Father Amos held a light with one hand and a radio with the other, his glasses fogged uselessly on his face. Nora kept Mara wrapped in her coat despite the dog's furious desire to go back down the hole herself. When Caleb was finally pulled up through the narrow rescue line, he emerged soaked, shaking, and gray with cold. Hands caught him. Mason's hands among them. Strong, practical, not gentle, but certain. For a second, Caleb could not stand. Then Mara broke free from Nora and reached him. She pushed her head under his chin with enough force to nearly knock him sideways. Caleb wrapped both arms around her, his face buried in her wet fur, while someone threw a rescue blanket over both of them. "I told you to go," he whispered. Mara pressed closer. "I didn't say you could scare me half to death doing it." Her tail thumped once against his leg. Father Amos, standing nearby with snow on his eyebrows and his glasses hanging from one ear, looked around at the gathered rescuers and said, "I move that Mara receive voting rights at all future town meetings." For one breath, nobody reacted. Then Nora laughed, not politely, not softly. A real laugh, cracked open by fear and relief. June laughed next, then one of Mason's volunteers. Then even Mason made a sound that might someday grow into laughter if given proper shelter. It was not celebration. No one cheered. No one crowned Caleb a hero under the lighthouse. People were too cold, too tired, too aware of how close the tide had come. But something shifted in the yellow wash of rescue lights and falling snow. Roy Danner, who had come up with extra blankets from the harbor shed, stepped forward and handed one to Caleb without meeting his eyes. "Here," he said. "Ranger." The word was quiet. It reached Caleb anyway. Mason crouched near the flagged survey line, studying the disturbed snow, the position of the equipment, the fresh crack in the rock. His face had gone hard in a way that no longer had anything to do with Caleb's past. "This wasn't just weather," he said. Tessa heard him. So did June. So did Caleb, still kneeling in the snow with Mara under his arms and the rescue blanket around his shoulders. Above them, the lighthouse remained dark. Below them, the cave held its rising water and its steel witness. And between the two, in the cold human space where suspicion had stood for so long, a small and stubborn warmth began to gather. The truth did not arrive like thunder. It came in boxes, cardboard boxes on Tessa Harrow's kitchen table, digital copies on encrypted drives, photographs printed, numbered, and sleeved, tide tables with dates circled in red, Silas Whitaker's journal pages scanned under careful light. June Larkin's interview notes stacked beside old town records. Mason Rourke's rescue report clipped to a map of the cliff, his thick pencil marks showing where the survey crew had placed vibration stakes too close to hollow stone. Truth, Caleb learned, did not look heroic when it was trying to survive. It looked like labels. It looked like timestamps. It looked like Tessa saying, "No, not that folder, the other folder," with the severity of a battlefield commander defending a hill made of paperwork. 3 days after the rescue, the stone house smelled of coffee, wet boots, old paper, and the chowder Nora kept bringing because she had decided investigation required calories. Caleb moved more slowly than usual. The cold from the cave had left an ache in his knees and shoulders, though he did not mention it. Mara mentioned it for him by blocking the hallway whenever he tried to carry too much firewood. "You are not my commanding officer," Caleb told her. Mara stared. "Fine, acting commanding officer. She allowed him one armload. Outside, the lighthouse stood above them, still dark, its glass lantern room rimed with frost. Below, the cave had been sealed temporarily by order of the town and state inspectors. The old vessel remained where it was, no longer a rumor, no longer a curse, no longer the private burden of a dead engineer and his reluctant grandson. But proving what it meant took longer. Tessa organized the environmental evidence with a patience that made everyone nervous. She prepared chain of custody notes, identified which markings on the sealed containers could be photographed safely, and wrote a summary that managed to be both calm and terrifying. She refused to let June use any words stronger than the evidence allowed. "If we overstate," Tessa said, tapping a page with her pen, "we hand them a shovel to bury us with." June nodded. She had changed in small ways since the first diner meeting. She still drank too much coffee and forgot most of it. She still kept her notebook open like a shield. But now she asked slower questions, better ones. She let silence sit long enough for people to decide whether they had more truth in them. Before publishing the first article, she brought Caleb a draft. He found her on the porch one gray afternoon, shoulders hunched against the wind, a folder tucked beneath her arm. Mara sniffed the folder and then June's coat, as if checking whether journalistic ethics had a scent. "I need you to read a section," June said. Caleb frowned. "Why?" "It concerns your military record." His face closed before he could stop it. June noticed. She looked down at the folder, then back up. "Not for permission, I know better than that. For accuracy. And because the last time I wrote about you, I treated official language like it was the same thing as truth." The wind moved between them. Caleb did not take the folder right away. Old wounds were strange creatures. Sometimes they snarled at kindness more than cruelty, because cruelty was familiar and kindness asked them to trust daylight. Finally, he accepted the pages. The article did not make him noble. It did not polish him into a wounded monument or place a halo over his old flannel jacket. It said only what could be supported, that prior reports concerning Caleb Whitaker's discharge contained unresolved contradictions, that a defense contractor involved in the earlier inquiry had ties through a chain of subsidiaries and liability agreements to companies now connected to Sylvain's corporate history, that June Larkin had previously reported on the case using official sources whose completeness was now in question. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stopped him. "This newspaper regrets relying too heavily on institutional language where human consequence required greater scrutiny." Caleb read it twice. The apology was not dramatic. It did not beg. It did not decorate itself. It simply stood there, plain and uncomfortable, doing the work. He handed the folder back. "Leave that sentence in," he said. June's eyes softened. "I planned to." "Good." Mara leaned against June's knee. June looked down, surprised. Caleb said, "That's rare." "What is?" "She usually makes reporters earn contact." June gave a small laugh that was almost a sigh. "How many footnotes does she require?" "Depends how wrong you were." "Then I owe her a bibliography." The articles began that Sunday. Not one explosive headline, not a miracle, a series. June wrote about Silas Whitaker first, not as a mad recluse or a haunted lighthouse man, but as a naval engineer whose warnings had been dismissed across decades. She wrote about Barrow Point and the cold storage site, about residents whose complaints had been filed away as insufficient. She wrote about Voss Maritime Disposal, its name changes, its partnerships, and the way old companies could vanish on paper while their consequences remained in soil and memory. Then came Claire Dunham's evidence. Claire did not stand on a courthouse step with cameras flashing. She submitted documents through a protected channel with counsel, trembling hands, and a silence that cost her more than bravery would have in stories. Her internal drafts showed that Solvane had known about abnormal land data near North Lantern before Graham increased his offer for Caleb's property. The omitted sample locations matched too closely with Silas's marked zones to be waved away as coincidence. When federal investigators arrived, they came in plain vehicles. That disappointed Nora, who had expected at least one dramatic windbreaker. "You'd think Truth could afford better costumes," she said, setting a pot of stew on Caleb's stove. "They're investigators," Tessa replied, "not parade marshals." Still, a little lettering wouldn't hurt morale. The investigators interviewed everyone. Tessa spoke in measured paragraphs. June provided records and source timelines. Claire gave statements through protected channels. Mason Rourke submitted his rescue report and photographs of the survey stakes, the disturbed snow, and the equipment placement near the hollow shoulder of the cliff. Mason did not embellish. He did not need to. "Rock doesn't lie," he told one investigator. "People do. Equipment depends who places it." Graham Voss remained courteous through all of it. That almost angered Caleb more than if the man had shouted. Graham gave statements in rooms with clean windows. He expressed concern. He praised transparency. He spoke of responsible transition, historical complexity, and the importance of allowing facts to guide process. His suit stayed immaculate. His voice never rose. But courtesy had limits when paperwork began to answer back. Emails showed internal concern about legacy exposure. Memos referred to North Lantern acquisition priority in language too urgent for ordinary staging access. Legal notes advised limiting unnecessary historical context in public materials. None of it was a villain's confession. Real harm rarely signed its name in red ink. But the pattern formed. Silas's journal, the old maps, the altered reports, the strange urgency to buy the house, the survey activity too close to unstable rock. 3 lines of evidence met at the same dark door. The federal review was announced on a Wednesday afternoon. Solvane's offshore project would be paused pending an independent environmental and historical assessment. The cave, vessel, and surrounding cliff area were placed under protective review. Additional testing would be required at Barrow Point and several old fill sites. Winter Harbor did not celebrate. Not exactly. The town had wanted jobs. It still did. A paused project did not pay heating bills. No article, no investigation, no old journal could mend every roof or fill every freezer. Caleb knew that. So did everyone else. But something important changed in the way people spoke about the future. They stopped saying if the project comes. They started saying if it can be done right. That difference was small enough to fit in a sentence and large enough to hold a town. One evening, Roy Danner came to the stone house with a crate of split wood in the bed of his pickup. He unloaded it without explaining himself. Caleb stepped outside with Mara beside him. "You selling that?" Caleb asked. Roy shut the tailgate. "No." "You delivering apologies by the cord now?" Roy rubbed his weather-red cheek, annoyed by the question and perhaps by the fairness of it. "I still need work," he said. "I know." "Town still needs work." "I know that too." Roy looked toward the lighthouse. "But my grandson fishes off Barrow Point in summer. If there's something wrong under that ground, I want to know before I tell him stories about progress." Caleb nodded. Roy glanced at him, then at Mara. "Dog looks smug." "She's been insufferable since the rescue." "She earned it." The older man climbed into his truck. Before leaving, he added, "You need more wood. Ask. Don't freeze up here proving a point." It was not an apology. It was better suited to Maine. In late winter, the letter came. Official envelope, official seal, official language so careful it had probably been washed and ironed before mailing. Caleb read it beside the upstairs window, where the sea spread gray and wide beyond the glass. Snow fell in slow flakes, gathering along the sill. Mara slept at his feet, her body pressed against his boot as if even dreams required contact. The letter stated that a review of prior findings related to Caleb Whitaker's military separation had identified procedural irregularities, incomplete source disclosures, and contractor-provided materials that had not been properly verified. His conduct record would be amended. Formal regret was expressed for adverse consequences resulting from incomplete review. Formal regret. Caleb read that phrase several times. There had been years when he imagined such a letter as a trumpet, a sword returned, a courtroom standing, a wife turning back at the door, old friends calling, his name washed clean in one bright tide. Instead, it was paper, good paper, necessary paper, but paper still. It did not give back the years in the van. It did not unteach people how to look away. It did not return him to the man he had been before he learned how easily honor could be filed in the wrong drawer. Mara opened her eyes. Caleb folded the letter carefully and placed it in the desk drawer beside Silas's compass. Then he sat for a while with his hand resting on Mara's back. Some wounds did not vanish when someone finally said the correct words. They simply stopped bleeding into every room. The compensation offer arrived later through town and state channels, tied to property damage, protective access restrictions, and cooperation with environmental review. Caleb laughed when he first saw the number, not because it was funny, but because money had a strange habit of appearing after the worst thing had already happened. He did not refuse at all. That would have made a fine story and a foolish life. He accepted enough to repair the stone house, reinforce safe portions of the cellar access, secure the cave under professional supervision, restore utilities, care for Mara, and replace the Econoline's failing heater before it achieved martyrdom. The rest he placed into a small trust with help from Father Amos, Tessa, Nora, June, Evelyn March, and several townspeople who had once watched him through diner glass as if he were bad weather. They named the place Whitaker Archive. Tessa insisted on the word archive because museum invited people to touch things, and center sounded like a grant proposal wearing cologne. Nora argued for the dog-founded house. Father Amos suggested lantern shelter and was voted down only because Mara sneezed during the proposal, which everyone accepted as procedural feedback. The official name became Whitaker Archive and Winter Room. The front rooms held maps, copied records, environmental complaint files, photographs of the old vessel, and Silas's journal displayed in a protected case. Tessa arranged the documents with such severe order that even Nora lowered her voice near the table. The back rooms were made warm, cots for winter nights, lockers, a small kitchenette, a shelf of donated books, a list of services pinned beside the door. Rules written plainly: no drinking inside, no weapons, no questions before coffee, clean up after yourself, and Mara outranks everyone. Caleb had argued against the last rule. He lost unanimously. On the first opening night, snow fell gently over North Lantern Road. Not a storm, a blessing-sized snow, soft enough to decorate the dark without burying it. Nora arrived carrying stew and announced, "No nonprofit survives without enough salt. Compassion is lovely, but it has no flavor." Father Amos hung the restroom sign on the coat closet and claimed it was a spiritual test of orientation. June photographed him doing it, which he called entrapment. Tessa placed archival gloves beside the Silas display and glared at anyone who breathed too enthusiastically near the records. Mason checked the exterior lights, the handrails, the cliff fence, and every knot used to secure the warning line near the sealed cave entrance. Claire came late. She stood in the doorway for a moment, wearing a dark parka with no Solvane logo and holding a box of field manuals. She looked thinner than before, not in body, but in certainty. Caleb met her near the entry. "I didn't know if I should come," she said. "Most people here didn't at first." Her eyes moved to the Silas display, then to the winter cots. "I believe the project could be good." "It still might be," Caleb said, "if it learns to tell the truth before asking people to trust it." Claire nodded. Her throat worked once. Mara approached her. Claire stood very still as the shepherd sniffed her boot, her sleeve, the box of manuals. Then Mara sat and leaned lightly against her leg. Claire closed her eyes for half a second. "I suppose that's conditional approval," Caleb said. Claire gave a weak laugh. "I'll take it." As the night settled in, people came and went. Not crowds, nothing grand, a few townspeople, 2 men from Amos's church basement, Roy Danner with more wood, Evelyn March with paperwork and a pie she admitted was store-bought because justice had limits. June moved through the rooms with her camera, quieter than usual. At one point, she asked Caleb to stand outside. "For the paper?" he asked. "For the record?" He almost refused. Then Mara stepped onto the porch first and looked back. That settled it. Caleb stood before the blue door of the stone house in his red and black flannel, patched at the cuff now, his beard silvered by snow. Mara sat beside him, black and gold coat dusted white, bent ear tipped toward the house, brass tag shining faintly against her chest. Behind them, warm light filled the windows. June raised her camera. "Ready?" "No." She took the picture anyway. Later, Caleb would see that photo and not recognize himself at first, not because he looked younger. He did not. If anything, the winter had carved him deeper. But he looked present, as if he had stopped bracing for the door to close. Near midnight, after the last bowl had been washed and the first 2 winter guests had settled into the back room, Caleb climbed the path to the lighthouse with Mara at his side. The restoration was modest. No great maritime beam. The tower would not guide ships through fog or sweep the Atlantic with official authority. Its new light was smaller, warmer, shielded toward the sea, aimed mostly inland and down toward the house and road. A local electrician had called it symbolic, with a tone suggesting symbolism made poor wiring. Caleb had paid him anyway. Father Amos, Nora, Tessa, June, Mason, Claire, and a few others gathered below near the house. Caleb opened the small service panel. His fingers rested on the switch. For a moment, he thought of Silas Whitaker standing alone with maps no one wanted. Nora's Eddie coughing through winters. Tessa carrying copies of copies because originals could vanish. June reading her old sentence and deciding not to hide behind it. Claire pressing send on a document that might cost her comfort. Mason choosing duty over suspicion. Roy bringing wood instead of speeches. He thought of himself in the Econoline beside the harbor, waking before dawn because survival had become his only schedule. Then he looked at Mara. She sat in the snow beside him, solemn and patient, the little pale streak on her nose bright in the dark. She had found the passage under the house, yes. She had led him to the cave, to the hidden vessel, to the evidence Silas had guarded. But that was not the miracle. The miracle was smaller and harder. She had led him back to people. Caleb flipped the switch. Light bloomed in the old tower. Not a hard beam cutting the sea, but a warm lantern glow spilling over snow, stone, roof, road, and the faces below. The house answered with its own golden windows. The cliff, once a place of whispers and locked doors, shone softly under the winter sky. Nora cheered first because Nora believed silence was overused. Father Amos removed his cap. Tessa pretended to inspect the wiring. June lowered her camera after taking one photograph too many. Mason looked toward the secured cliff path and nodded once. Claire wiped at one cheek quickly, as if snow had somehow fallen upward. Mara leaned against Caleb's leg. Below them, the Atlantic breathed against the rocks. Above them, snow drifted through the new light like tiny messengers returning from some long exile. The stone house beneath Whitaker Light had once been called cursed because people needed a word for fear that would fit in the mouth. Now its doors stood open. Its rooms held records, blankets, coffee, arguments, warmth, and the stubborn evidence that buried things could rise without becoming monsters. Caleb placed one hand on Mara's head. "Well," he said softly, "you found the submarine." Mara looked up at him. "But you found me first." She yawned. It was an enormous yawn, rude and perfectly timed. Caleb laughed then, not much, not loudly, but enough. The lighthouse kept shining behind them, not for ships, not for commerce, not for the old hunger of men who wanted the sea to obey. It shone for the road, for the house, for anyone coming over the hill in winter with nowhere safe to stop. And in that soft light, as snow brightened the Maine night, and the ocean kept its ancient breath below, Caleb Whitaker understood at last that a home was not the place where trouble ended. It was the place where truth could come in from the cold and find someone willing to keep the fire alive. In the end, Caleb did not find peace because the past disappeared. He found peace because the truth finally had a place to breathe. Sometimes the things we fear most are not curses at all. They are memories waiting for light, wounds waiting for gentleness, and doors waiting for someone brave enough to open them. And sometimes God sends that courage in the quietest form: a loyal friend, a second chance, a warm room, or a small light shining through the snow. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us about a time when something broken in your life became a doorway to healing. And if you'd like more stories of hope, loyalty, and grace, please subscribe and join us again. May peace find you where you are, and may a light be waiting on the road ahead.